we're going to be going over what the kind of the priorities are that we see in this year's NOFO, some changes from prior years. So Katie's going to head up that part. And then I'm going to be talking in a little bit of more detail about the funding that we have available, how HUD is going to evaluate and score our application, and then some timelines and some next steps. And then we're going to move right into recommendations for new project funding that the board is going to be asked to vote to approve. So that's kind of what the next 45 minutes or so is going to look like. So I'll turn it over to Katie.
Wonderful. Thanks, Amanda. Yes, so we wanted to start this off just giving you kind of a snapshot of the NOFO itself. And so just a couple of kind of key things to keep in mind as we're talking about this. So the NOFO was released on August 18th, and HUD has slated it to be due on November 16th. So just around 90 days, just under, that we have to kind of complete that application and get that back to HUD. The NOFO it's 97 questions, and it's kind of a range of questions are in total in the NOFO. So it's a pretty lengthy document that we will be answering as a community. And really, if you think about kind of how to boil down those questions, they're really asking kind of four main things, which is really asking the communities to describe how we are doing things within the community, or how things are really going in the community. So it's asking us to talk to how things are. Then it's also asking us to describe what has been done by the community to address the way things are, what the community is doing to address the way things are, and then what we're doing or what we will be doing in the future to address things. And so HUD's really kind of trying to understand how things are going and then what we're doing. And so it's really heavy into narrative, a lot of writing, and it's kind of addressing multiple different pieces of the system, which we'll kind of go into in a second about what HUD's priorities are for the NOFO. And so that's kind of just in essence, kind of the things that HUD is looking for. And so we can dive into what their priorities are so you can understand a bit more kind of what the questions are that HUD is asking. And in the kind of NOFO analysis that Amanda and I provided for you, we've listed out these priorities in there as well. And we've listed out what we have kind of from our cursory assessment of our system, what we're kind of thinking are kind of our high level strengths related to the priorities, as well as our high level weaknesses. And so that's kind of detailed out in a little bit more detail than you see on the slides here in the packet in that table there. And so the first priority that HUD has listed for this year is ending homelessness for all persons. And so when we kind of think about how are we doing in relationship to this, one of the things that we're doing really well is that we continue to see a decrease in the total number of persons experiencing homelessness in Detroit. And so that's great to see those numbers trending down, that every year we have a little bit less people in our annual count. However, one of the weaknesses that we do want to identify is that while we see the overall numbers trending down, unfortunately, we do see the numbers trending up for specific populations. For instance, we've seen youth homelessness trending up. And so while overall things are moving in the right direction, it's not moving in the right direction for all persons. And so those are things we need to address as a system. Another priority that HUD has this year is using a housing first approach. And so this one is a return to this priority. In the last NOFO in 2019, HUD had been moving away from housing first. And so this NOFO is really adamant in affirming HUD's commitment to housing first and kind of a returned emphasis from HUD to housing first. And so really kind of ensuring that folks have low barriers to accessing housing, as well as low barriers to maintaining housing. And so when we think about how are we doing as a system, one of the strengths that we have is that we do have a really clear commitment as a system to promote housing first, and we work to provide training and accountability for that commitment. We'd also say that our rapid rehousing and PSH projects really have done a lot of work to reduce barriers and and to try to make accessing those programs as low barrier as possible. And we also think that they do well in operationalizing housing first principles overall and kind of helping folks to maintain housing and keeping barriers low to maintaining that housing. Some weaknesses, though, that we want to identify for this is that there are still some providers who struggle to comply with the housing first requirements implemented by the CoC, and they struggle to comply with keeping programming low barrier. We particularly see this often among our emergency shelter providers. And then another area of weakness is just our length of time to housing. So the time it takes for us to get somebody housed is it continues to remain higher than what we would like to see it as. And so that's another area that we can continue to work on. The next kind of priority is reducing unsheltered homelessness. And so some of the strengths that we have in this area is that there are continuous efforts to improve coordination and outreach. And we continue to see improvements in relation to our outreach efforts. Some kind of exciting things that have been happening in the community is that there's been a number of outreach pilot programs that have been initiated in the CoC that are really kind of working to address kind of specific needs and issues within our system. And so it's kind of great to see some creative solutions to really engaging with folks. There was also an effort between the CoC and the city of Detroit to develop a policy in relation to how encampments were closed. And so really trying to create equitable practices to ensure kind of as minimal harm as possible when certain decisions are made in our community. And so there's, those are great things that are happening. I would say an ongoing weakness that we have is just there's a general wariness among folks who are unsheltered to engage with the homeless system, and kind of that creates some resistance to kind of receiving support. And so there are kind of barriers for some of our more chronically homeless folks to kind of engage and receive support so that we can help successfully move them out of homelessness. And so that is a weakness that we struggle with there. The next kind of priority that HUD identifies is improving system performance. So one thing that we've been doing as a system that is a strength is we've really been working, the Performance and Evaluation Committee in particular has been working to evaluate our system performance measures and to develop system level strategies to kind of address the areas where performance improvement is needed. And so that's really us. And then also kind of a strength that you could say that we have is 2 out of the 8 measures that HUD is measuring for system performance this year, we saw an improvement in our performance. However, unfortunately, it was only 2 of those 8. So we did see a decline in 3 of the 8 measures. And we also saw 3 of the 8 measures remain the same. And so system performance does continue to be an issue, a major issue kind of for our CoC, and one that we need to continue to discuss and address and strategize for. So then we can go to the next one. And then the next strategy is partnering with housing, health, and service agencies. And so I think one of the strengths is that there has been some work recently to partner with a number of various systems. One of those being the workforce development system. And then there's also been work to partner with the education system. And so kind of through those targeted efforts, there have been improvements that have been made to our system to really improve the kind of coordination between those systems and hopefully to lead us towards better outcomes for the persons who are kind of served by both of those systems. And so we're grateful kind of for those efforts underway and kind of the improvements that are coming to it. The pandemic also really kind of facilitated us to really strive to coordinate with a number of different entities. And through that, the health system was one of the entities that we were able to better coordinate with, particularly the Detroit Health Department. And so there has been some growth in that area as well. A weakness, though, that I would emphasize for us is is the kind of need to continue to improve coordination with a number of different systems. So we've listed kind of 3 of the big ones here. We still really need to work to build our connections with criminal justice, child welfare, and behavioral health. I would say there's also still room for improvement for our connections with the education system. While there has been growth, I think we still have a good bit of room for continued growth there. But I think system coordination is definitely an area that we want to continue to work on and grow in. The next kind of priority is racial equity. So HUD has really put an emphasis that CoCs are addressing racial equity. And so some of the strengths is that he has really been putting an emphasis on racial equity recently as well. And so there's been a number of different efforts at the system level to really try to assess our system and develop strategies for how we can become more equitable. And so some of those include the work that was done with NIS and the development of the Housing Justice Roadmap. Some of that includes the work that was done with the HMIS team has been using tools provided from HUD to kind of analyze our equity or analyze our system through an equity lens. And then there's also a survey that the HMIS team put out to really try to understand the leadership within the Detroit CoC, both in the makeup of the CoC, but also in our orientation towards equity and how we orient ourselves to the work. And so there's been a number of different pieces of work that have been moving forward, which is great to see. And through that, we were able to develop a vision that really strives to root our system in equity. But some weaknesses that I would say is that while we've done a lot of the work to assess and analyze, there are disparities that still continue to exist within the system that we need to address. And we've also got to kind of figure out how to address the ways that we've seen the system is breaking down and causing inequities. So definitely still work to do to continue to move us towards a more equitable system. And then I believe the last priority is on the next slide, which is really elevating the voices of persons with lived experience of homelessness. And so some of the strengths that we have in relation to this, there's been a lot of work actually that's been happening to this. And so that's kind of exciting to see that also our CoC has been moving in this direction as well. So there's the development of an advisors group for people with lived experience of homelessness. That was initially part of the work with NIS, but our CoC has now adopted to really help drive our work forward permanently. And that's really exciting. There's the creation of the engagement coordinator position, which is happening, which is also really exciting to really kind of have a position that's devoted towards the work of elevating the voices of people with lived experience. There's a number of active efforts across the system to really improve representation. And there's also efforts right now to develop a policy to guide how we compensate people with lived experience for their engagement with our CoC, which we'll be talking with you guys about actually a little bit more later today. And so a lot of exciting things happening. One thing that I would say maybe that kind of flags as a weakness here, though, is there's been a significant increase in the number of grievances we've received this year. And so that just seems to potentially indicate that there is some general unrest with clients in our system and maybe a general dissatisfaction with how services are occurring in the system. So while we're working to elevate voices, there seems to still be a sense though that the system maybe isn't working for everyone and we need to continue to improve and adapt and make sure we're honoring the voices that are coming to us. And so so those are the priorities. And then I'm just briefly going to kind of go over with you guys too. I just wanted to highlight some of the changes, some of the ways that the NOFO has changed from past years to this year. So one that I mentioned is the returned emphasis to housing first, that it had been kind of reduced in 2019, but now we see it kind of back in full force as HUD saying this is absolutely a priority that we hold. There's an increased emphasis on coordination, and HUD's really particularly looking to see from communities that there's coordinating in kind of two major areas, one between housing providers and healthcare services, but also just between the CoC and the ESG funded entities. So really making sure that the CoC is coordinating with the recipient of ESG funding to make plans for how that funding is kind of braided together to address community needs, to make sure that we're really working together with the funding that we're receiving. There's also there's an increased emphasis on racial equity. And it's kind of, again, two major ways that HUD is really looking to hear from communities on how we are addressing equity. The first one is they really want to know that communities are working to identify disparities and take steps to mitigate them. And then they also are particularly looking to see for the ways that we're addressing equity in our local CoC funding competition. And so that's definitely a new piece that we're seeing HUD kind of bring to the forefront this year. The next priority is they just really, or the next change, I guess you could say, is that HUD has given a good bit of this application to really have communities respond to what our system level response was to COVID-19. And so they're looking to really understand kind of what challenges we faced, how we addressed those challenges, and how we coordinated with other folks. And this is kind of a fairly large chunk of the application. It's actually 12% of the total points possible are devoted to this segment right here. So HUD has really kind of put an emphasis on pandemic response in this application. And then the final thing that we see is there's a significant decrease in the emphasis on database metrics this year. So the performance pieces where HUD's wanting to see what the data is telling them about our system, they're moving away from those just for this year, or not moving away. They have just lessened the emphasis on them for this year, but we don't anticipate that lower emphasis will remain. We believe that next year and in future applications that HUD will return to their emphasis on data, but that due to kind of the ways that the pandemic has impacted CoC function, they have temporarily kind of suspended some of their emphasis, but haven't removed the emphasis altogether. So with that, I will turn it over to Amanda to talk more about other aspects of the NOFO.
All right, great. Thanks, Katie. I'm going to go into some more of the details to talk a bit more about how much funding we have available and some more of how the application is going to be scored. I also did respond to Amy's question in the chat with some details around our performance on some of the system's performance measures. Some more details on that were also given in the board packet too, so you can refer to that document for more details. But to start with, so question on everyone's mind, how much money do we have to apply for? So we have a total of just over $34 million that we could submit for funding. And in the chart there, I'm comparing that to how much money we had available in the 2019 competition. You'll see some comparisons throughout to 2019. As you know, there was no competition in 2020, so 2019 is the most recent year that we can really kind of compare back to. So that's why you're going to see some 2019 comparisons. So I'm going to go over this chart and some of the dollar amounts that we have available in some details. So again, 34 million is kind of the grand total. That does not include the amount available for CoC planning. The CoC planning dollars are a separate kind of pool of funding that could not be, they're not dollars that can be used for programming. So it's not included in the total amount that we have for programming. So the amount that we have in what's called our annual renewal demand, or ARD, is just over $28 million. And just to kind of define a term here, ARD, or the annual renewal demand, is the dollar amount that it would take to renew all of our renewal projects for 1 year. So that sum total of all of the dollar amount of our renewal projects this year is just over $28 million. So that is our annual renewal demand. You'll see that is an increase from 2019, and that is due to some projects that came up for first-time renewal between 2019 and this year, and also some increases in funding that HUD makes for fair market rents between the years. So that's kind of why we see that number has ticked up a little bit over the past couple of years. So the amount of funding that we have available for new project funding for CoC bonus funding is just over $1.5 million. and the amount that we have available for domestic violence bonus funding, which is another pool of new project funding, is just over $4.5 million. So we're going to, at the kind of the next sort of piece of my presentation, we're going to dive into some recommendations on uses of this new project funding. So I don't want to linger too much on this point, but just note that the amount that we have in CoC bonus funding is comparable to kind of what we expected. We usually, receive a little over $1 million to almost $2 million in bonus funding. So that dollar amount was in line with what we were expecting. The amount that we have available for domestic violence bonus funding, $4.5 million, was significantly more than what we were expecting. And this is partly because this is basically like a double allocation because there was no competition in 2020. HUD really kind of doubled up on the amount of money available for the DV bonus dollars. But we'll get into some more kind of recommendations on that new funding in a moment. And then just lastly, the amount that we have, again, for CoC planning is just over $900,000. So again, these are dollars that are allocated to hand as the CoC lead agency. You'll see a comparison in 2019. There was just under $800,000 available to us. In the 2020 competition, because HUD canceled the competition, so they kind of automatically awarded hand the full amount of CoC funding, CoC planning that was available, which was about $840,000. And at the August board meeting, we talked a bit more about kind of planning for those planning dollars. So you should anticipate some kind of additional conversations around planning for these planning dollars in the near future. One thing to note about these CoC planning dollars, these 2021 dollars, is funding that would actually be spent in calendar year 2023. Our CoC planning dollars kind of operate on a different spending cycle due to a number of reasons. So that's just kind of something to keep in mind there. And again, as I've noted before, these planning dollars are not dollars that we can use on housing and services, just due to the way that kind of the regulations kind of apply to these dollars. They're not able to be used for housing or services. So just want to make it clear, it's not as though we're using this money and taking it away from direct services. It's money that can only be used to support kind of the work of the CoC lead agency. Okay, I'm going to talk a bit now about the CoC application scoring criteria, and again, doing some comparison to what we saw in 2019. So this is the scoring criteria that HUD really evaluates and scores our entire CoC application on. So that application kind of that Katie was talking about just a moment ago, this is really what HUD looks at when they score and evaluate us. So in 2019, there were a total of 200 points possible. There's only 163 points possible this year, but then there are some bonus points that HUD has kind of thrown in there, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So it's just kind of interesting that we're seeing sort of that reduction in the total number of points that are available. And HUD has sort of they kind of do this every year. They sort of shift things around and recategorize things from sort of one scoring section to another. So sometimes it can be challenging to do sort of a direct year-to-year comparison in terms of the different sections in the application and how they score it, because they sort of make some changes. For example, this year, they are combining this section around performance and planning and CoC coordination and engagement. So for whatever reason, they decided to sort of combine those two sections into one section around coordination and engagement. But other than that, this chart is intended to kind of give an overview of the percentage of points in each section out of the whole. That sort of really helps us to think through how much emphasis and how much value HUD is placing on these different parts of the application. So as Katie kind of alluded to, they're really looking at significantly this year around how did we coordinate and respond to COVID-19. So questions related to that are all kind of within the CoC coordination and engagement section. So that point value is more. versus you'll see that system performance section that has decreased in its weight, and that is due to HUDs kind of putting a lesser emphasis this year on those data-driven components. New this year is bonus points that are available. There's kind of two different sections in bonus points. HUD has always had bonus points available for CoC mergers, which has never really applied to us because the Detroit CoC has not really recently pursued merging with another CoC. So that's not one that we've really talked much about. That's largely targeted a lot more to like really smaller CoCs to encourage them to merge with larger CoCs. But new this year is bonus points around coordination with housing and healthcare. And these points are available to the extent that we're able to demonstrate in one of our new project applications, the extent to which that project is able to leverage other housing resources or other healthcare resources that it may be bringing to that project. And so based on the new project recommendations that we're making, we feel like we could be in a good position to be able to get, if not all of those 10 points, close to all of those 10 points based on the new projects that we are recommending for funding. I briefly want to touch on, and we've alluded to this before, some of the differences in the weight that HUD is placing on the data-driven components. So what we mean by data-driven is the scored components that are based solely on the data. So HUD is looking at, for example, how many people did we count in our point-in-time count 1 year compared to the prior year. And then we get a score based on whether our performance improved. So there's different data elements or different points related to that on some of our point-in-time count data and our system performance measure data. So for those of you who have been around, you may recall in 2019 in our application, kind of in this middle section here, HUD placed an increased emphasis on the number of points that were possible for data-driven elements, and we struggled to earn a significant number of those points. And so our overall application score in 2019 was not as high as we would have liked it to be. So this year, what we've circled is that HUD has significantly reduced the number of points that are available to us through these data-driven measures. And based on our estimate, we do estimate that we will earn most of those data-driven points that are available. This is also detailed in the board packet. So that's good news. On the one end, we are anticipating being able to earn a greater proportion of those points that are available. As Katie said, however, we know that this is going to change in the future. HUD has already, they said so in the NOFO, that in future competitions, they will be, again, increasing the weight of which they look at those data-driven components. So this was HUD's way of sort of giving us a reprieve this year because of the pandemic. However, that is going to change in future years. So quickly, just some kind of timelines and next steps. So just to remind everyone, when we talk about the CoC competition, there's kind of two branches to this process. There's the local application process, which has been underway since the beginning of this year. That's the process by which we make our local decisions on which projects we want to submit for funding. So where we're at with that process, so today the board is going to be asked to vote on new project recommendations. In October, towards the end of October, there will need to be a special meeting with the members of the board to vote on some additional new projects, and I'll kind of explain that in a moment. So we have some votes coming up around new projects. And then in November, the board is going to be asked to vote into eSnaps, to the online application portal. So we have a lot of work kind of happening behind the scenes there. The other kind of part to the CoC competition, the CoC application, is what we call the national application process. So that's where we're actually writing and completing the CoC application. So that work, again, is already underway. So what we can expect is at the October board meeting, the board will be asked to provide input to some draft pieces of the application. And then in early November, the CoC membership is going to be asked to vote to approve the final application. We will need to call a special meeting of the CoC membership just because nothing is aligning with our regularly scheduled meetings. That's kind of how this usually happens. So be on the lookout for a special meeting in early November for the CoC membership to vote to approve the final application. So with that, I'm going to, I do want to keep us moving along to the new project recommendations. I do want to take a moment to look at Celia's comment for just a moment though. Yes, Celia, I see your comment. That is something that I think is new in the NOFO regarding just some sort of expansion around youth and some of the kind of where they can kind of be coming from and the documentation. So yes, we can definitely explore that